In this video, we'll look at how to fix a noisy Singer sewing machine treadle. We'll focus on adjusting these nuts found at the base of this metal rod called the pitman rod. It's easiest to work from the back side of the machine when making this adjustment. Here, we can readily access the nuts on the top and the bottom sides of the treadle plate. When this joint is loose, sewing can be a noisy, clunky experience each time the treadle plate moves. To fix this, we'll start by releasing the lower nut. Support the treadle plate while gripping both nuts and turn the lower nut clockwise a few turns. This drops the treadle plate and gives us some working space. And now we're ready to tighten the joint. Tightening and loosening of the joint is done by turning on the upper nut. Grip the lower nut and make a clockwise turn on the top nut in order to tighten the joint, being careful to make only small turns at a time. Then reassemble and test the adjustment. If the joint requires further adjustment, repeat the process of separating the plate from the rod and turning the upper nut clockwise. A good way to keep track of how much you are tightening by is to use the sides of the hexagon shape as a gauge. Think of each of the 6 sides as one small turn. Always use small turns, as over-adjusting can jam the rod or, worse, bend or break it. I'll demonstrate by tightening this as far as it will go. See how rigidly the arm is fixed into the treadle plate now? This is too tight because the pitman rod needs a bit of space in the socket in order to move properly. I'll pedal a few times now to show what happens when the rod is overly restricted within this joint. I've only pedaled a few times, but it's enough to lock the rod into the socket. Let's remove the bottom nut to have a look. The upper nut is now no longer movable in any direction, and it means that the rod is also locked into position. To get things moving again, let's take the rod completely off the treadle assembly. Start by removing the bottom nut. With the treadle plate off, we can better see how the rod is completely frozen within the socket. Continue removing the rod now by turning clockwise to unseat it from its housing. With the rod freed from the treadle assembly, we'll have an easier time unlocking the jammed socket. Using tools to pry this joint free may result in damage, so I always recommend using a drop of oil and wiggling things free by hand as much as possible. In this case, the rod came loose easily enough, but had I treadled longer and harder, it may have become permanently lodged in the joint. Remember that this nut is currently tightened all the way, so the rod is not moving as freely as it should. We want the joint tight enough to stop the rattling, so it makes sense to tighten it all the way and then loosening it only by one small turn to give the rod just enough space to move within the socket. And now it's ready to be reattached to the treadle. Screw the rod counterclockwise into the housing to reattach it. And lastly, reconnect the treadle plate. And now I can treadle without worrying about jamming the arm, and best of all, without noisy clunking of the knocking treadle irons. And a final note. It's a good idea to tighten the nuts firmly with pliers or wrenches once the adjustment is completed. Hold the upper nut firmly in position and rotate just the bottom nut, rotating counterclockwise.